And a very good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101 on Tuesday evening. David Hines here, welcoming you wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from inside of Guyana, dear land of Guyana, or whether you're joining us from the United States of America, in Canada, in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom. Welcome to Politics 101. Those of you who are joining us from the wider Caribbean, whether it's in Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, the Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Of course, those of you who are further afield, those of you in St. Martin, welcome to Politics 101. Brothers and sisters out there in our South American continent, particularly in Suriname and French Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. Good evening to all of you joining us from Guyana, and thanks to all of you who were with us last night. We got some responses to the program, helping to celebrate AUC Guyana's birthday, 98 and batting. 98 and batting. Thanks to all of you who came out and showed some love, because often in politics, love is a scarce commodity, and we were glad that we were able to share some love. And I was glad that I did that program, because when Burnham turned 100, I pleaded with my Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters across the aisle. So let's have a civilized discourse about Burnham and what he meant. And I was saying that to someone who didn't support Burnham. When I came of age, my aunt who raised me had left the PNC. She was a member of the Women's Auxiliary. And when the split occurred between Guyana and Burnham in 1971, she left, and she was a Guyanite. She left the PNC. So I never grew up in a PNC household, you know. I never did. And my early days in politics, of course, were during the time of the Burnham regime. And I was part of the WPA, which was opposed to Burnham in many regards, Burnham's regime. But I was making the point when we were observing Burnham's 100th anniversary, that we were 6 decades into independence, and we must have learned something about political tribalism and how divisive it could be, and how it could blind us to certain reality. And as a scholar, I had been searching my own mind about how does one explain the Burnhams of this world, because Burnham was not single. He was part of a generation of African and Caribbean and Asian leaders in that post-World War II wave of political leaders. And during my studies, I began to ask myself what it was about that post-colonial moment, that early post-colonial moment, that it produced these leaders. And then Nkrumah and Nyerere, these men, the two of them especially, played important roles, but yet they governed over the one-party state. And you know, and you ask yourself, Burnham, you know, likes it or not, he is part of that wave of post-colonial leaders. He had a positive impact. And some of us, the question, what was the cost of that impact to the larger society? But asking those questions and answering them do not mean that you discard all of Burnham, because in doing so, we are discarding all of ourselves. Burnham came from deep within our Guyanese and Caribbean belly, to quote David Rudder. And so therefore, I wanted to initiate a discourse after 60 years of independence that speaks to, and I don't like the word, but I'm going to use it, that speaks to inclusivity. And the reason I don't like the word is not because it doesn't have meaning. It's because it's used in Guyana to mean exclusion. But the question arises that if you are a power sharer like myself, that believe ultimately for Guyana to advance, we have to be able to share the decision-making power. I am in no doubt about that. I do not have time for Jack Dio and Irfan Ali and Nandalal and these guys. I don't have time for them. But if half of the population votes for them, then I have to have time for them because they're representing people. And so therefore, I am intrinsically a power sharer. And one cannot share power with demons. And that is why I've refused to demonize Dragon. I've refused to demonize Burnham, because I have to share power with their representatives, their heirs, their party. And you can't share with demons. And Jack just found himself, he has found himself in that trap. He said the other day that he does not believe in power sharing because we don't share values. He doesn't share values with the PNC. By extension, you therefore saying you don't share values with those who vote for the PNC and have voted for the PNC historically. So something is wrong when you start off from the premise that there is them and there is us, and we don't share anything. And so therefore, I wanted to start that conversation about Burnham in February, because I knew in March, it was going to be Dragon's turn. And our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters, and I'm not just talking about the PPP, I'm talking about other Indianists, they refused to. They said Burnham was a demon, and no matter how much lipstick you put on him, still a demon. And so come March, when they said Dragon was the father of the nation, what do you expect the Burnhamites to say? They said exactly what I expected them to say. That Dragon is not the father of the nation, it's Burnham. Conversation over. Conversation over. Conversation over. And I knew April was coming and that I was going to talk about Guyana. And June is coming and I am going to talk about Rodney. And so last night's program was done in that vein. Not to demonize, there are people who have problems. I've had problems with Guyana and the decision he made. I can tell you there was a generation in Buxton, loved him, but they felt in 1953, when Martin Carter and Rory Westmus proposed Guyana to be the first premier of Guyana, because Burnham and Dragon couldn't agree. And to break the impasse, Carter and Westmus proposed Guyana. And Burnham said, I will support Sydney. Dragon remained quiet. And I'm quoting Guyana here. Guyana said, once Dragon remained quiet and didn't give his full support, he was never going to go into that seat. and he declined. He would have become the first premier of Guyana in 1953. And some of his contemporaries in Boston held it against him because they said he should have taken the position. And then in 1964, as head of SCREA, a number of African Guyanese went to him and asked him to run in the 64 election as SCREA. And he said he went to Burnham and told Burnham people were suggesting it. And I'm quoting Guyana here. Burnham said, if you do that, it will send the wrong signals to our people. And Guyana said he walked out of that meeting and said he will not go down in history as the one who split the black vote. And many people thought that in 64, SCREA would have done well enough to become the balancer, and that Guyana could have become prime minister, the first prime minister. And there were Bostonians who held those two things against him because they felt that here was one of their own who could have twice, could have been the numero uno, and he didn't. And they would whisper those things to us youngsters and said, I hope you all don't do like Brother UC and give away power. Yeah. So I'm saying to say that it is not that Guyana is not perceived as someone who made political mistakes, but he apologized in a 1978 article called Racial Insecurity, that he, in the early 60s, he made the mistake of painting all Indians with the same brush, acknowledging that he made errors. And so now is not the time for us to be cursing down each other, whichever camp we come from. But to be talking, I think, about the positives, not ignoring the negatives, put the negatives in perspective, but to be in this era of oil, when we have a chance to wash away all the ugliness of the past that we see in the image and reality of poverty, that we ought to be talking up the positives of our experience, not ignoring the negatives, because that will be equally dangerous. Not to be guided by the negatives. That's the point I am making. Because we are at a critical juncture in terms of our own nationalism. You look at Trinidad, where are the Black powerists who tried and almost overthrew Eric Williams in 1970? Some of them are in the PNM itself. Look at where the revolutionaries who actually overthrew Gary in 79. Many of them are in the NNP, which is the successor to Gary's GULP. The leader of the UPP, one of the two major parties, was the right hand in Antigua and Barbuda, was the right hand man of Tim Hector. He's now the leader of the UPP in mainstream politics. Trevor Monroe, the leader of the Communist Party of Jamaica, the Workers' Party of Jamaica, is in the PNM. He was actually a parliamentarian for the PNP, sorry. And I can go on and show you that the left wing, the radicals who confronted their own leaders in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, have now come together in the interests of the nation. That is why we in the WPA joined with the PNC in forming the APNU. And people talk about the PNC killed Rodney. Rodney was murdered, assassinated. In 1980, we are 43 years later. Are you going to tell me that Aubrey Norton assassinated Rodney or Aubrey Norton was part of the cabal? It's nonsensical. Aubrey Norton is never going to stop me or any WPA person from saying what is a fact, and that is Rodney was murdered by the regime at that time. But are we going to be imprisoned by that? Or are we going to remove the shackles so that we can come together and build our Guyana? And that's the conversation I wanted to start with Ravi Dev and others, but they refuse to grant Burnham an inch. I, who was imprisoned under Burnham, who had comrades who were killed under Burnham, I was and am prepared to have that broad conversation. And those brothers refused. And so therefore, when it came to talk Dragon, they were on their own. Because Burnham's lieutenant, Hamilton Green, said plainly, Dragon is not the father of the nation. I don't have to agree with Hammy, but I understand what Hammy was reacting to and is reacting. And I tried to warn my brothers about that in February, but they cared not. And those are the people who are shouting from the mountaintop that people like David Hines is racist. They went to Babu John and used Jagan's memory to cuss stinking nationals, stinking. I do that. No, too much respect for that man. I have disagreements with him and still do. But I will never use his anniversary to cuss anybody. And that is why last night we wanted to use as an example. Celebrate our brother Guyana without cussing anybody. I hope we have taught this nation something by our example last night. Our example. I hope we would have taught the nation something. Tonight, we come on here to discuss with the People's Senior Counsel, Nigel Hughes, an important document, I'm calling it a document, more article that he wrote. An important document. And it's titled 3 Years After. What are the tea leaves telling us? Because in 2020, Nigel Hughes raised the question about sharing the corn. How are we going to share the corn? Now, 3 years later, what have the tea leaves disclosed? How are we going to share the corn? That's what he raised. He started by saying the elections of 2020 have reaffirmed what we have all suspected has been the reality of British Guyana and Guyana since the abolition of slavery. We are and have always been a deeply divided society. Since May 1966, this is Nigel Hughes, there has been no significant change in the voting patterns of our people. Whether driven by fear or loyalty, our main ethnic blocs have repeatedly reaffirmed the preference to be governed by their own kind. That's how Nigel Hughes started the movement. And he's asking 3 years later, what have the tea leaves told us? Well, Nigel is here tonight, and we are going to take on that question that he raised himself. He's a fanatic Caribbean follower and student of Caribbean music. And you would know Bob Marley said, I and I plant a corn. I and I build a cabin. Now you look me in my face with scorn.
Oh, didn't my people before me slave for this country? Now you look me with your scorn, and you eat up all my corn, and you know the rest.
That's right. And David Rudder, at the end of the Cold War, wrote a calypso called 1990. And he talked about the shoulder, the eagle on the shoulder of the bear, or is it the other way around? And he asks whether the end of the Cold War would mean any change for the third world and for Black people and brown people. And he asked in that calypso, please make a liar of me. Please make a believer of me. Which one are you going to make, a liar or a believer? And here today, Nigel Hughes in through Rudderite, tradition, he's asking whether the 3 years since 2020 have made a liar of him or a believer. Nigel, believer or liar?
David, I'd like to start tonight with your permission, first of all, by wishing Brother AUC the happiest of birthdays. I watched your program last night. I thought it was a fitting tribute, and I was particularly impressed with the history that you brought to bear, because quite often, especially in contemporary Guyana, we don't remember the struggles that all generations and all peoples in Guyana went through to bring Guyana to where it is today, which is not a happy place, but there were grave sacrifices made. And Brother Guyana stands at the top. I thought it was particularly educational because, particularly for young people, I was unaware that Guyana was the author of that statement, this confounded nonsense. And just now, in your introduction, I did not know that Guyana was twice. I know he was once proposed as premier. I was unaware of the second occasion. So I want to thank you, because it's particularly important for people who want to discuss contemporary Guyana, that they are exceedingly familiar with the history of the country, with all its warts. You can't be familiar only with the good things that coincide with your view, but you've got to take into account those things that you may not have been happy with. And so I want to commend you, because quite often when we struggle for a better place, we forget to thank the people who are actively involved in the struggle. And you have been, and I just wanted to thank you for that. In response to your question of whether I'm a believer or not, I put that out there because, and I'll tell you the reason why I republished that article if I could. Takuma, when I was about 15, 16, and my father would take me to WPA meetings, John Street, Campbellville, Garnet Street, all over the place. Takuma was one of those persons who was always actively there, trying to make sure that everybody was okay. And I grew up because, of course, like any kid growing up at the time, the WPA was the political organization that captured the imagination of young people. And of course, it brought the excitement with it. And the fact that they were challenging Burnham's regime, I think, added something to it. And I grew up with knowing Takuma as a person who fought vigorously against the Burnham regime. Takuma was locked up several times, that I know. He was actually imprisoned, he did time. And David, from my perspective, and I only speak for myself here, where citizens have given their time and their liberty in the fight for a better Guyana, we owe them at least the expression of gratitude, and we owe them. So when you messaged me and said Tacoma is looking for representation, to me that was a synchronom. But to come to why I republished that article. So I was thinking about Tacoma, and I was thinking, 72 years old, you've given your entire political life and actual adult life to struggling for a better Guyana. And if we compare where we were in 80 to where we are now in 2023, I am sure he goes through moments where he must think, what was this really for? Was it worth it? The one thing I can say about the political discourse in the 80s, certainly late 70s and 80s, it was of a much better and higher quality, even though one may say that the odds perhaps were a little stronger. So I thought about it, and then I went back to elections in 2020, and I thought of the old brouhaha, and thought, let me look back at what I'd written, and to see, just as a measure, because that was a marker, that was written probably 2 weeks after the elections. There was a lot of noise being made about democracy, etc. I remember having a long conversation saying, look, this fight, the elections is really not the cause, it's just the occasion. And so I thought it might be useful as a country for us, for me certainly, and for those who I engage with, to look back at my assessment at the time, just to see whether we had made progress in the 3 years. And it was pretty frightening that we really had made no progress. As a matter of fact, from my perspective, one would probably say we've gone backwards. And it means that we have been marking time for 3 years. And in addition to that, we now have the real questions staring us in our face. It wasn't staring us in our face as obviously in 2020, because we were talking about, people were arguing about democracy and all sorts of things. But today, the question is the corn. The question is, how are we going to share the corn? And we know how the corn is being shared right now. I think Brother Bob was very, very clear in how the corn is being shared at the moment. And so I thought it was an appropriate time to republish that, so that we all collectively, those that despise the things that I say and you and I, that we could have a discussion about where we are and about the corn.
And Nigel, lest people in the audience feel that it took the 2020 election for you to come to the realization about this corn, I want to take them back to 2018. In my village, our organization, the 1st of August movement, invited herself, C.Y. Thomas, and Brother Raphael Trotman. Raphael was not well, and he sent a representative from his Ministry of Energy at that time. And it was in 2018, August, that Professor Thomas unveiled what has now become the Buxton. Yep. And there is that picture of you holding the mic for Dr. Thomas as he made his presentation, holding the microphone. They came to question him, made a warning, missing that time. And to raise question there about our equal and how that is going to play out in the age of oil. So there was Thomas making an intervention about how the corn, one way in which the corn can be divided equally. And here you are saying, hold on, Professor, I am the student here, but I'm putting up my hand. Have we thought through enough the question of our division? Will our division allow us to share the corn in the democratic way that you're proposing. Take it from there, please, my brother.
David, you bring back some very interesting memories. That Buxton proposal day when Professor Thomas made the proposal, I remember my instinctive reaction was, and this is, again, C.Y. Thomas, again, I have to confess, revered in my view. As a child, grew up, this was one of the leading thinkers about a new Guyana who was hostile to Burnham. And I think if you give me a 30-second opportunity here, a lot of people forget that sometimes the persons who were the strongest opposers to Burnham and who fought Burnham tooth and nail for a different Guyana were African Guyanese. A lot of those that paid the ultimate price with their lives were African Guyanese. So, this conception that today, that because you're Black, you're PNC and you're always PNC is completely distorted. Kwame Nkrumah, several people lost their lives fighting Burnham. The WPA was the vanguard, the intellectual and political vanguard for fighting Burnham. It was a multiracial party. So don't let us misinterpret that part of history and get caught in this discussion where there are people who are suggesting that because you're African Guyanese, you have to be pro-Burnham and you're always either PNC member or pro-PNC. The shades of opinion that were African that opposed Burnham or had different views to him were many. But be that as it may, your question is about the 2018 proposal by Clive. And I was going to say, you hear a world-class economist, respected by many, put forward the proposal about how he thought that we should start to be able to distribute the wealth. Because one of the big discussions that is going on now is, well, it's not a discussion actually. The present government has one view about how this wealth is to be treated, and nobody is analyzing it. So, for example, yesterday at the local content conference where Vice President Jack Deo delivered a presentation, he spoke about filling the loopholes in the Local Content Act so that, for example, international investors who lend money to Guyanese to be able to satisfy the Local Content Act. He wants to close that loophole. The bottom line with that is, unless you have money, the Local Content Act does not apply to you at all. You have to have capital resources. So the approach of the government is essentially about building and increasing the wealth of a very small part of the population, less than 5%. Because the average Guyanese, and when I say average Guyanese, I'm not talking about worker here. The average Guyanese engineer, the average Guyanese person who has a trucking service, the average Guyanese who is skilled and perhaps in a position to take advantage of the oil industry doesn't have the capital resources to do that. So when you're proposing local content, particularly where the country doesn't have the skills to be able to contribute, what you're doing is your economic program is about growing the wealth of a small part of the population, which is predominantly Indian, yes, but it also leaves out the entire, well, not the entire, it leaves out most of the African population and certainly a large chunk of the Indian population. And so one of the debates that we fail to have right now in Guyana is what is the economic model that is going to really, truly, and in an equitable way, redistribute the wealth. You can't approach that from a racial point of view. You have to approach that from a pure economic point of view. And what is happening here, which is what Professor Thomas was trying to avoid in his proposal, and I'll tell you why I reacted the way I did to him in a minute, is that he, like me, would like to see a fairer, more equitable distribution of the opportunities to grow in this new oil economy. It's not we're not talking about equitable distribution of the wealth where somebody walks around giving out a check every week to people. We're talking about an equitable opportunity to grow for everybody? And what is the economic model that you are going to design that is going to allow this wealth to actually get transferred, not by trickle down, but get transferred to a place where a larger part of the population can benefit from the equitable distribution and equal opportunity than the 4 and 5% who have capital resources that can then say, well, okay, I can afford 4 million US. The foreign investors coming with 3.5 million US, 7 million, let's go. The average person can't do that. And the other thing is, no person in Guyana who can only borrow money in Guyana at 12% or 10 to 12% can compete with foreign persons who are coming in to invest that are borrowing money at 5, 6, and 7%. Even in Trinidad, if your credit is bad, you get it at 8. So what Clive was saying here is we have to find, this is what he was saying in 2018, we have to find a way. And he spoke about perhaps one of the methods that he thought that could directly transfer wealth would be the payment of proceeds by way of cash to citizens. I instinctively reacted, perhaps displaying my historic class, which is perhaps middle class, and I said, no, professor, we have some issues here. One, if we start distributing, people start to develop a feeling of entitlement. And what we need our people to understand, particularly African people, is that this is not an entitlement. Our foreparents worked, and we have to work even harder to be able to deliver and take advantage of the equitable distribution. So what we want is equal opportunity and equitable distribution. 2, I felt that in Guyana in 2018, as I've always felt since I've come back to practice in Guyana, that we are an inherently unequal, imbalanced, hostile collection of people or tribes, whatever you want to call us, living in the single geographic space with limited foresight that we haven't even appreciated that even if we don't like each other, we have to share the same space. And like anybody who recognizes that you have to share the space, you have to work out the optimal modalities for managing that space. And the optimal modalities is not the exclusion of people that you have to share the space with. It's to work out a political system and structure that allows each of us, despite our differences, despite our suspicions, despite our lack of trust, to be able to feel that we have a fair share and an equal opportunity to participate equitably in this space. And that's before we even come to the question of reparations and history and contribution. Because in any society, you have to look at the contribution to what is the modern society and who made that contribution. And there can be no doubt that the modern Guyana, the infrastructure of modern Guyana, and Rodney spoke about this at length, that the infrastructure for Guyana was built on the backs of free labor by the enslaved. I noticed that one of our political commentators has now described this as transferred. So I suppose the new name is we are descendants of transferred Negroes. Yeah. But we don't want to get into that.
Right.
So David, that is what I think Professor Thomas was saying. And I was, like I said just now, those were my instinctive apprehensions.
Yes, let's get back to the document. And I'm calling it a document because I think it's an important intervention that 3 years later, it resonates perhaps even more than it did 3 years ago. And after 3 years, and I'm going to ask you, although I think I know the answer, but I must ask you because we are involved in a conversation, even if the conversation is not embraced by all and sundry. Have we come to grips with the notion that if we do not endeavor to share the corn, we could sooner than later end up losing corn and husk.
David, I say exactly that. And that is the history of countries that don't pay attention. Guyana right now is perhaps the most attractive location for people who are interested in oil. I don't say for investment, for people who are interested in oil. And oil, as you know, is perhaps the most politically volatile commodity in the history of this planet for the last 40, 50 years. People have gone to war and there are constant wars over it. We have been gifted this find, not we, the find has been located in Guyana. We don't have the wherewithal to understand what goes on in oil politics globally. And so while these two minor people in a population that is less than 1 million people are tearing each other apart, you have to look at what is actually happening to the ownership of that oil, and more importantly, the global policies that will impact Guyana as a result of the wealth that is generated from that oil. And we're not even in the game. We are not even in the game. So by the time we have fought, and I think, and sadly, I think it's inevitable that we're heading there, given what's going on in the society. When we finish that domestic battle, this economy will be so tied up in hands that are not Guyanese, worse than colonial times. When you used to say Booker Guyana, because you felt Bookers owned the whole country, we are going to end up in a position that is worse, and it's going to be far more sophisticated because the instruments which are going to be used to tie the economy up and divert ownership elsewhere other than in the decision-making processes of the nationals of the country, by the time we wake up, we're in a different world. We are going to be in a different world. And it's not like long ago where you got to have transport over a specific plot of land. You can tie up the national debt globally in financial institutions that can completely wreck your economy. And we don't have a diversified economy. We've never had. We've always had a one-product economy. Sugar's finished oil. And we won this lottery and we're thinking it's absolutely fantastic. And we don't even have collective decision-making about how we are going to build the future of this country. Now, how are you going to do that? How can you have one side of the coin, 51% of the population, 52% of the population, making every single decision about the future of this country alone without consultation with the other 48% of the country, and expect that you're going to have optimal decision-making, but more importantly, that the decisions you make are not going to be subject to reversal when there's a change in government. You can't run a country that way. You just cannot.
Nigel Hughes here tonight talking about the corn. How are we sharing the corn? How are we going to share the corn? He's revisiting something he wrote 3 years ago. And he's asking, what do the tea leaves tell us 3 years after? Nigel, look, I have decided in this phase of my activism that I think African Guyanese are in trouble, economically, trouble politically, increasingly psychologically in trouble. And I have decided that in this phase of my activism, that I am going to put a lot of energies into restoring some dignity, some sense of balance among African Guyanese, because I think if we don't have that sense of balance and that sense of dignity and consciousness, that Guyana is doomed. African Guyanese are too central to the Guyana cosmos, that we cannot leave them out in the pasture. And so I have decided on that. But I have friends and comrades who call me and said, well, David, you must talk a little bit about Indians. David, you must talk a little bit about socialism. David, you must talk a little bit about imperialism and oil. I get that every day because David become a Marxist again. My friend Rafi loves to tell me that because I come out of a radical Marxist tradition. So I have people who are telling me, speak about all of these things. And I go back to that night, 2018 moment on that stage at Friendship Primary School in Buxton. And I have to confess that at that time, I didn't realize that oil was going to bring the collision of all of these things. And each element of all these forces would want you, the activists, to engage their element. How do you deal with the collision of all these elements that are at play? Race, class, gender, country versus tongue, farmers, public servants, and now the armed forces. All of these are colliding in the age of oil. Help me make sense of it, because I am laboring.
David, I just wanted to add two other areas that are affecting the African community: health and education.
Yeah.
No, you cannot have a country where any sector or any community, any race, any ethnicity, any tribe is in difficulty and the nation be called healthy. Let us go to the indigenous people, much smaller than the African population, 10%. And let us go to the data, because we have these discussions from a very emotive and rhetorical perspective without discussing them from the data position. Let us look at the indigenous people and find out what's the average school leaving age. Is it 10? Is it 9? And what is the average literacy? Then let's look at the African population and look at the data for that. Let's look at the literacy. Let's look at the average school leaving age for men. It's much younger. For boys, sorry, much younger than women. And then let's look at the Indian population and let's look at the data. And then let us examine the disparity between these various ethnic groups on education, as we should do for every other sector, health and the others. Let us examine that, because before we can start talking about a new Guyana, we have to have the data. Otherwise, we're going to just literally have a cuss out, which we're experts at. But it's no point having a cuss out if you don't have data. The fault lines for Guyana have been there from inception, from 1964, when we had the elections, and 1966, when we became independent. And if you want to go back to the PPP before it split, the fault lines have been there. And that's why I started, not in the 50s, but I started in 1838. Because when the African people, the enslaved African people, came off of the plantation, their labor was replaced by the importation of East Indians to Guyana, by the British. And the British were very concerned about the strength of the African people numerically and otherwise. And you will remember, that's why flooding land in estate land is so sensitive to Black people, because that's exactly what the colonialists did. And the colonialists wanted to make sure that they had a counter to the African population. So they made sure that by 1911, that's the crucial year, they had imported more East Indians than they had Africans, because they wanted the bulwark. The African people grew up knowing that their foreparents had labored forever, unpaid, for this land. And there was no talk of going back to Africa. You see, the Indian people came here and they had the option. They could go back to India or they can get paid and stay here. That was not an option African people had. So from the time the enslaved came here, this was their home. And it is out of this that we have begun to build what you call a Guyanese and Caribbean society. So the fault lines were there since 1838. The Indian population was confined. That's how come we used to have bongyards. They were confined to estates. So the opportunity for social intermingling, etc., didn't exist. They came with their religion intact. They came with their culture intact. And so to a certain extent, they felt that they were different and better positioned than the African population. So these tensions were there. Our foreparents had to migrate to the cities to get work simply because they started to shut down the economic opportunities in the villages. Only the Portuguese got licenses to sell in shops. So Black entrepreneurism in terms of being able to sell in Black communities didn't exist because they didn't get licenses. So we've always had these fault lines way before we got into the 1900s. They were there from the start. The Portuguese sent breads were 1899. These fault lines have been here forever. We've had some great opportunities and demonstrations of collective action. Remember when they shot the Indian workers in Rumvelt? You had the African people who marched. We have had those opportunities, but as a people, we have never had a collective common set of ideals. And we have to accept that. And we have to understand that that's not because we want to be that way. That's historically how we got there. So those fault lines are there. It is always in a crisis or in a time of abundance that those fault lines get big and be more pronounced. And that is what has happened to us now. The amount of money that comes with oil, the first thing that surfaces is greed. I want this for me. And I don't want you to get this. And so all those ugly fault lines about how this society was built and structured. We never had a conversation about how we were going to build Guyana. We've never had, and that's why I keep saying we occupy a common geographic space, but we have never had a conversation about that. Our national motto, one people, one nation, one destiny. If you have a candid conversation with a lot of people who are not African, they will say that that was a PNC imposition on Guyana. And it comes with the national songs. It's only now people beginning to sing national songs because a lot of that, in the 70s, David, you start singing national songs, people tell you you're PNC.
Yep.
I mean, one of the best national songs I have heard, and I come from a family that opposed Burnham, was I Want to Build This Land That Belongs to Me.
Oh, yes.
The National Service song. And I remember when I was in Saints, that was considered a PNC government dictatorship song. I come back as a student, having read Fanon and all that stuff, and it's a completely different perspective. But that's what we grew up in. If you sang, I want to build this land that belongs to me, fantastic lyrics, that was considered PNC. And if you ask 90% of the middle class Black people from the 70s and 80s, they will tell you there was a Burnham song and that they had a natural, hostile reaction to it. So Guyana has a lot of nuances that we don't want to explore. What has happened is the present economic policies have pushed all of the African Guyanese backs against the wall economically. They don't have a chance. They can't participate. So everybody who at one stage had a different view of Mr. Burnham now is examining what he actually was trying to achieve. If you think of it, when we were growing up, Burnham was supposed to be the second or third richest man in this country, in the world, sorry.
In the world.
Burnham's estate, I mean, if you look at his children, if you look at his widow before she died, it is evident that Burnham gave his life to the country. He didn't acquire great wealth. But you see that, and again, and you touched on this in the introduction, the left in the Caribbean, one of the reasons I think there's been a migration from the extreme left to the center of politics is because what is happening in the Caribbean is now we understand, I think, better. Perhaps we've got our own universities, so we're not following the colonial interpretation of history, just like how Walter wrote how Europe underdeveloped Africa, that re-examined that economic relationship. Now we are looking at the economic history in different lenses. So what is happening now is the left understands that, yeah, it's great to fight Burnham and etc., etc., but we lose the corn, as happened in Grenada. Grenada had a revolution. Morris was there. Bernard was there. They both had their specific skills. And look where it ended up. So the other thing that I don't think we give credit to, and this includes Chetty and Burnham and AUC and all those people who came through the 50s and 60s, is that was first generation power. They had no ancestors, no elders to go back and say, when you have this kind of tension between blacks and Indians, how do you manage this? How do you get the Meiji, the Pandit, the priest together to work out how this happened? It was the first time we were coming to power. And naturally, any generation coming to power or trying to get power for the first time is aggressive. They don't have the benefit of history to stand off and look at it. C.L.R. James, always in his criticism of Rodney, said the time has to be right. And sadly, I mean, I don't blame Mr. Burnham, first generation power. When you are anxious, the whole world, India, Kenya, the whole world was self-determination for its population. That's the ferment that was going on. All these guys studied together, quote unquote, in the motherland in England. And so the ideas were coming out and they were anxious about moving into this new era. So we got to cut them some slack, because when we look back with 2020 vision, sure, we can say several of their decisions were bad. But at the same time, if you look at perhaps what Mr. Burnham was trying to achieve with national service, and I've heard several Indian people say this, it was the first time they got exposed to the way in which African people grew up and communicated. And similarly, several African people said it was the first time they got together. The idea was different, but it got buried in other things. And so when we come to today, contemporary society, we can't have a discussion where you say that be writing off Burnham or you're writing off Chetty. It's not, you can't be serious when you're doing that.
Nigel Hughes here tonight. We were having this discussion of where we've been these past 3 years. And notice we're not cussing out anybody. We're having a mature discussion, and a discussion that probably will make some of us uncomfortable. I think some of the Burnham people in the audience may be a little bit uncomfortable with the way in which we are discussing Burnham. Some of the Rodney people in the audience may be somewhat uncomfortable, because we are looking and say, maybe those early years of independence, we didn't really suss the thing out enough on both sides. But as I said at the beginning, 6 decades later, it affords us some space in which we begin to, I see my brother Leroy Nelson talks about the complexity. And I think that's what we are engaged in. These former colonial outposts, small island and mainland states, but they are the cusp of modern, what I call modernism, what my ideological side call modern capitalism. There is no understanding of the evolution of capitalism, Western capitalism, without taking into consideration the role played by these little islands and mainland states. In that sense, as C.L.R. James has said, the Caribbean is probably the most modern of societies, because you can't talk about world revolution without taking into consideration these little spaces. And that is why C.L.R. James, I'm going to say this, ask Nigel my next question and shut up. C.L.R. James traveled to Mexico, where Trotsky was living after he was exiled from Cuba. And I saw C.L.R. James in a lecture. He said, and I went to Mexico, and I told Trotsky, he does not understand the Negro problem. This is the 1930s, so the word Negro. He doesn't understand the Negro problem. He doesn't understand Black America and the Caribbean. And Trotsky, in that time, as you know, was a big name in leftist circles, and that James himself was a follower of Trotsky.
But Trotsky didn't understand. And I think part of what we're seeing with some of our leadership is a lack of understanding of the complexity of these places that we call home today. Complexity in terms of the role they have historically played, complexity in terms of the groups that came here under different circumstances and have had to engage in the challenges that come with the way in which we came here. And I think part of our task today is to try to figure that out. Nigel, what you've seen in the last 3 years, and you can comment on anything that I said in that little commentary there. But after what you've seen in the last 3 years, how do you see all of this playing out at the level of the people? We see where the leaders are, and we see the play of the leaders. But ultimately, leaders are not the sum total of a country. Ultimately, it's the people. How have your observations of the last 3 years, what the tea leaves are telling you about the fate of the ordinary working people, the toilers?
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity for that. That's a big one. My instinctive response to that is this: we have to look at what is going to happen economically to this society. The current policies, the current economic policies, and the current policies of the present government are going to make, like I said, the class of people that have capital, because they're the only people who can benefit under the system, because they're the only people who can invest. There's nobody else. Local content, you have to have money to enter into a joint venture with a foreign company. So only the people that have capital resources will benefit. So the next thing you have to look at is who has capital resources. That's an obvious thing. If I cannot raise 10 million US dollars to invest in marine services, I'm out of the game. I might get employed, I might do well, I might be an engineer, and they might give me 2 cars. I tie you up in a mortgage for 30 years and be happy. But the only people who are going to make capital, or who are going to make money, is that very small class. Let's just look at that data. You're then going to have the next band of people who are providing some services. All middle class. Well, this is going to be the new middle class. That's also going to be small. When you look at, just let me go back and make this point with capital. There is virtually no capital available in the African community for serious investment. That's a statement of fact. But we have to make sure we publish that data. We have to make sure that that data is available, just as how when I put together that program about economy and justice, the work has to be done. And we have to start off by saying, what are the capital resources of the African community? This is not a discussion about how they ended up there. That may help you, but it is, you have to deal with what you have. And so the class with capital will do exceedingly well. Coming out of schools, don't get sidetracked by the fantastic results of people doing 25 subjects. Look at how every year, what is the mean age for people leaving schools and qualifications? In the urban society, boys are leaving school at 11, some not even finishing primary school. By definition, David, with the best will in the world, if all you have is a primary education, your future is dead unless you're into illegality. You cannot make it in an oil economy with a primary education. Can't happen. So it's either you're going to wait for somebody to come around and give you a check every $5,000, every whatever, or your future is dead. When you have a primary education and you can't keep a job, and the Lamborghinis and the Ferraris and the fancy restaurants are going up, and you are walking in that society, you don't have to go further than 55 minutes from Guyana to Trinidad and Tobago, because we seem to believe that criminals don't have PhDs. Criminals have the better resources than the legitimate people in the world. And so look at what happened in Trinidad, and is it happening in Trinidad and Tobago? It is only a matter of time before kidnapping starts in Guyana. I don't wish it, but it's going to come. Because to that primary school leaver, I can't go and get a walk. They're going to allow me to buy a car. So I am, and I'm not going to sit down for the next 50 years of my life and say, oh God, things are hard. I am going to take my share because I am seeing everybody else taking their share. And what I'm going to do, I am going to stick people up. Now, that is going to become a racial problem. Why? Because more Indian people got money than Black people. That's a fact. You don't go stick up Black people and ask for ransom, and then the people don't have the money to pay you. That is inevitable, but that is going to be misinterpreted as political action of African people targeting Indian people. To me, it is a natural consequence of economic deprivation. You don't rob people that don't have money. It's a waste of time. So that is going to happen to thousands of people, because thousands of people, male urban people, are not graduating beyond primary school. And in an oil economy, this is the number one political and economic commodity in the world. You got to have the smarts. So that's what's going to happen. Now, you don't see it in the indigenous community because they're invisible. They don't live in the coast. They live in the interior. So the deprivation and the fact that their people are also not graduating, going beyond primary school, is not as impactful for several reasons. One, their communities are not urban. They can go back, they can farm, it's subsistence, existence. And so the impact is not as hard. The impact in the urban society, where each one of us got to drive down the road, is going to be more immediate. So that's what's going to happen to the mass of people, because if you look at the educational results at CXC, at CSEC, you will find that what happens is these people are not qualified. So you're going to hustle little drugs. I mean, if you go back to Gypsy song, Little Black Boy, you're going to try and walk in the maxi taxi, and that is your existence. And they are going to be, now let me just say this. Not because you drop out of school at primary school level means you're stupid. There are exceedingly smart people that drop out of primary school that will find ways that are not orthodox to make a living. And everything from fraud across the board is going to increase. So that's what's going to happen to the males. A little higher up the chain, and this is happening more and more because I've had a couple of conversations, surprisingly, with women who've started their own businesses, Black women, but they're getting knocked out because they can't get the contracts. The business is being diverted away from them to supporters of the present government. So they don't have an opportunity to grow their own businesses. Sure, they get celebrated. Sure, they go and they talk about new economic opportunities. But we should really examine the numbers of how many African businesses are really being given the same opportunity to grow. I hate to give you a personal example, but I have to share it. I got an email from a major client, US, yesterday that said, "Dear Nigel, we are very happy with your service, responsive, etc., etc. However, for us to be able to improve the prospects of our client succeeding in Guyana, we have been advised by our suppliers to look for alternate legal representation." This is commercial oil and gas. Namalan, this is Nigel Hughes, who is not invisible. Come 2, 3, 4, 5 levels down, where it is not that obvious. Imagine what's happening to those little African women trying to run their own businesses, whether it's engineering, whether it's consultancy, whether it's health safety and HSSE, trying to start their businesses. They got the UG degree and they know that this is really the key, but they ain't getting the contracts, or the contracts are so small and moderate that that class of people will not generate the economic resources to be able to make the difference, because the shots are going to be called not by the person who sits in the position of president. It's going to be called externally, because the main levers of this economy are going to migrate out of this country rapidly. And we don't even have the intellectual resources to sit down together and say, this is what we are facing. How do we begin to implement policies today that will stave off what is going to come generally? We are playing in big boys league. Oil can buy the best resources, research and otherwise, on the planet. Think about it. Who are we? We, where our universities don't even have research capacity, whether it's in economic science, to begin to believe that we are on the same footing when it comes to negotiating or anticipating or predicting the future. And it is not as if we've decided we are going to put our resources in artificial intelligence, which will be able to predict what the various outcomes are. Forgive me for doing this. When we went to negotiate about this contract, just think about it. Exxon is the biggest oil company on the planet. Just think of what that buys you in terms of resources. Who are we sending to negotiate? Who? Who do we believe has the capacity to begin to have that conversation? And these are the realities that we're going to face. But to come back to your question, so we're going to end up with the super rich. The families of the super rich are going to live outside of Guyana. That has been the history of the Caribbean. Whether in Jamaica, whether in Trinidad, whether in Barbados, the rich people will live where they can take the benefit of the first world. So they probably all live in Florida somewhere, or somewhere along, Georgia, that sort of belt, unless somewhere else becomes fashionable. But they will work here because it will become too dangerous from a personal safety point of view to survive in Guyana. It is not a pretty picture. And then when you add the corruption for law enforcement that is present today, you will remember in Trinidad and Tobago about 3-4 years ago, when there was a spate of kidnappings, that it was the police who were part of that plan. And that is going to be inevitable, because there's so much money that is going to be made off of kidnapping that the law enforcement agencies are going to get perverted. And we seem to think that corruption is acceptable because we pay the guy on the road some money. Don't put me through. But when it becomes pervasive, you have to live with the consequences of it. Mexico, 30,000 people shot by one cartel. When you get to that stage, the government doesn't have control. And it is so easy in Guyana to reach to that position. Come on, we can't even keep Iterengbang. We cannot even protect the people in Iterengbang. If tomorrow the Sindicato stormed Iterengbang, who we send in and in what? Well, they flying in Karaya plane and Jerry Gavaya plane to Iterengbang, with people sitting on the ground with AK-47s after they blow up the runway and they can't land. We not real. We pretend to be real. We couldn't seriously happen. And if you go to those border towns, I've had the pleasure of going there for pro bono work, you will see how easy when you sleep in that village. Anybody could run in the village in the night, stick up any village and leave, and we have zero capacity to respond. Now, we fighting ourselves in Georgetown, but you can give up a country two ways. You can give it up by actual physical invasion, or you can give it up by means of surrendering it because you don't have the capacity to protect it.
Nigel Hughes here tonight. Nigel, you know, one of the things I learned from political activism, especially from the Rodneys and the Guyanas, is that as you engage the struggle, you're constantly learning. And we have, from my reading here, live, and I can only read the destinations, the 5 destinations that I point the show. We have here live 2,885 people live. And that's only from the 5 destinations that I can see on my screen here. And I peek at the comments sometimes, and I've been trying to put some of them. But what amazes me is the awareness of our people that we are having a discussion tonight that means a lot. They use their own words, well said, intellectual, and so on and so forth. But it's the consciousness that they are in the presence of a conversation that somewhere in their minds they know that we must have. And they're realizing that we are having it here. Yet, there's some people who paint us on these platforms as dangerous, as racist, as destructive to the country. Is something happening within the context of social media with political discourse on the one hand by those who would rather not have these discourses, and the other hand, those who want these discourses? The collision of those two forces, do you think it will take us anywhere?
One of the things, David, that Guyanese are very good at, we've been talking for a long time. Unfortunately, the conversation has got very rancid and very sour. But we've been talking for a long time. And every time we talk, we don't do. We are not doers. We are not a people of doers. We don't do as we are people who've produced several citizens of high intellect, but we are not doers. That is where we have consistently failed. And I say that for many reasons. If you think of the Jamaican culture, if you think of Red Stripe, if you think of reggae music, if you think of dub, if you think of any of those things, it is now global. Whether it's in a film, you hear a Jamaican accent, whether it's you want a red stripe or a dread stripe, that's global marketing. And that comes from the essence of the people, that they don't see themselves as unequal. You ask a Jamaican, he is as big as the president of the United States. He does not believe Jamaica is a minuscule little country with 3 million people. It is the ability to believe in yourself and have big dreams. Guyana, let us pick Guyana. Banks there, other than the Guyanese community globally, don't know about it. There is nothing that we have done or taken advantage of as Guyanese that has indicated a confidence in ourselves. If you go into 90% of the households of Guyanese overseas, Indian, Black, Portuguese, indigenous, we will all talk about Guyana. We will all talk politics. It will all be negative. And none of us say, look, we gonna make it. I know things hard, we just don't have the capacity as a people. We're not a people. We don't have it. Whether it's because we have been born in this strife. Compare that to a Jamaican who he doesn't care. And this comes from a country, and we've got good antecedents, 1763, before the Haitian Revolution, before American independence, not only did we rise up in Bobis, but we ran the colony for a year. Internal strife caused problems. We don't celebrate. If you look at cricket, we had the greatest cricket team in the history of the planet was captained by a Guyanese. Why we can't celebrate? Why can't we take from that what it took and say, yeah, this is Guyana? Every time, you think of anything Guyanese, we are instinctively negative. And that's why I say we don't have the sense of nation. Trinidad, that has the same racial division. They believe in Trinidad. Carnival, the Trinidadian calendar from the time they hit October, it's carnival. It's not Black carnival, Indian carnival, Red people carnival, Douglas people carnival. It's carnival. They celebrate their people. And they celebrate what they have created of their culture. And that is what Jamaica does. Jamaica gave us Marley, and then you come forward, they gave us Buju. They give us just the attitude. Jamaica is an attitude. We don't have a Guyanese attitude. If you ask us what's a Guyanese attitude, we don't have it. And so the idea of a nation state has to start from in here. We got to believe in it. We don't. We spend so much of our energy just trying to beat up somebody else or explain why things so bad.
Yes.
Our instinctive reaction is can't. My father always used to, as children, say, don't start off by telling me you can't do it, because there's nothing that you cannot do. And that is our instinctive reaction, whether you're Indian, whether you're Black, whatever. And so we have this discussion, David, while we're having this discussion, great intellectual discussion, we're not doers. Tomorrow morning, Nigel Hughes is not getting up to go and do something about it. David, I commend you. You will continue to be an activist, but in terms of doing something concrete about changing our circumstances, it ain't happening. We're too busy right now in the African population trying to survive. And the problem with that is that where you put people in difficult circumstances, they will adopt difficult methodologies to get out of it. You don't have to look for it.
Tomorrow morning, you're getting up to go and defend Takumo Ogunsi. And that is as concrete as they come. I know you're being modest. But I have you there. And I'm so glad you raised that question, because part of what we do every night is to try to instill, well, first African Guyanese, that confidence in yourself as a Black people, and nothing to be ashamed of. And if that confidence can translate into be a confidence about our Guyana, but here they are telling people, oh Lord, racism they're teaching them. We're gonna jail them for telling people to be like the Jamaicans, the Trinidadians, the Antiguans, to be confident. Go ahead.
I was going to say this. We must not be embarrassed to discuss race. We must be comfortable discussing race. And if you think about it again, the second you start to talk race, people get nervous. As if you're going to attack them. We have to celebrate, let me say this, we have to celebrate our Indianness of that part of the population. They have done tremendously well. I applaud that. It is in that context that we have to begin to have that conversation. We have had some tremendous people who have come from every sector, and it mustn't be a cause of embarrassment. Why, I know if I can talk to the Rohan Kanai, because we come from different perspectives, and unless we learn and appreciate where the other person comes from respectfully and be willing to listen, we're wasting time. The two major parties in Guyana, and I made this in the point, don't want to touch race. And both of them depend on racial votes. How are you beginning to move forward? How are you beginning to move forward where the two major parties that get collectively between them in excess of 90 to 95% of the vote do that on the basis of race, but are afraid to acknowledge it? And we fall into that trap, and we don't want to have the discussion. Come on.
Nigel Hughes. Nigel, Takumo Ogunsi goes to court tomorrow. Lawyers say you don't discuss a case. It's sub judice and all those kinds of things. And so I'm not going to ask you any direct question, any comment, any report you want for us. I know you're very good at giving reports, updates on your Facebook page, so we know what's going on with some of these cases that you have been doing. And I want to thank you at a personal and political level for doing that kind of work. You know, I come out of a tradition that when I was young, the people of your father's generation, the lawyers, the legal icons, they came to the WPA office and they volunteered to defend us. We didn't have to call them. And when I see you, I remember Peter Britton until he died. Whenever he saw me, he said, "You are now famous. Tell them I was your lawyer." And Benjamin Gibson, Key Gibson's father, would say the same thing to me. "You are now famous. Tell them a BV lawyer." A BV, because Benji was from BV. A BV lawyer defend you. Nigel, I just want to say thank you. No. Because in the best tradition of lawyering.
David, I am humbled by it, but I will say this. I am merely the instrument and vessel through which the ancestors placed me here to assist this generation the best I can to move forward. This is not me. This is what I have to do. And like I said, Ogunse I knew as a kid, and I know the sacrifice that brother has given to Guyana. I can't repay him. The least I could do is use what I have, which I believe is some legal skill, to attempt to address him when he is in difficult circumstances. And I appreciate what you said, but just to understand that we are just part of the continuum. We are just part of the continuum, and we have to. It is almost imperative that we express our gratitude to those that have struggled to ensure that we can at least enjoy the comfort that we do at the moment, which is not much, but at least we are here.
Yes, and let me thank young Darren Wade for being part of that tradition as a youngster. I think we ought to be very, very proud of him. Ogunse goes to court tomorrow. What?
Okay, so tomorrow, what happens is the magistrate so Ogunse was charged under what's called the penalty section of the Racial Hostility Act. So that's the section that says anybody who commits a crime under this section shall be liable to imprisonment for a fine of $500,000 and imprisonment for 7 years. It doesn't say specific above it. There are two other clauses that create offenses. And our point on that was that you can't charge us under the penalty, you got to charge us under one of the two, because we need to know specifically what it is that you're alleging he did, which offense he committed. So the prosecutor, Mr. Mandel Moore, on the last occasion probably anticipated that we were going to take that point. He laid over his submissions. We asked for a couple of days to lay over ours, which is what we're going to do tomorrow. And we've said to the magistrate anyway, however you rule, we do need those particulars. So tomorrow we lay over the submissions. Her worship will either rule tomorrow or rule on another day. And then we will ask for disclosure of the statements of the witnesses who the prosecution intend to lead. We will examine those statements with a view to preparing our defense of Mr. Ogunse. When we get the statements, we certainly will share them with you, Mr. Ogunse, and the rest of the team. And as far as is legally possible, we will try and keep you updated with what the prosecution is alleging, whether they bring new charges. That's also a possibility tomorrow, because when they issued the wanted bulletin, they said that they have all the charges. I do want to make this point, though, David, is that we let so many things slide in Guyana. So this big wanted bulletin was issued for Mr. Ogunse. No one ever attempted to contact him, not a single person. So it means that you could issue a wanted bulletin that goes up on the internet, seen by the entire planet, that puts you in a category of wanted, which means you're a fugitive, you're a criminal. So by definition, a wanted bulletin puts you in a particular category. 2, you would have thought that if the police issue a wanted bulletin or go to the extent of issuing a wanted bulletin, that they are in some state of readiness and preparedness for when the person comes in. So whether you have questions to ask, etc., etc. Mr. Ogunse goes in, not a single question is asked of him. Normally, you only detain people during the course of an investigation if you think their release is likely to impact the investigation or they're likely to flee. A man who surrenders to the police station is not likely to flee. So that part of it is ruled out. And there was no suggestion at all that Mr. Ogunse at any stage was going to interfere with the investigation, because they had this on tape. They had been discussing it for weeks. Now, why would you detain a man like that and not give him his liberty, other than you intended to humiliate him by keeping him for the length of time that the Constitution permits if you have reasonable grounds. They had none. They questioned him once. What did they do? They play the tape and say, you have anything to say? He says nothing. And so this kind of abuse of citizens, it gets highlighted here because of the status of Mr. Ogunsi, but it happens every single night to young men in the city who get picked up and get locked up, and they know it's 3 days, and they sit down. The problem we don't realize is that level of brutalization to young men leads them to become hardened and leads them to become a little bit more brutish in their actions, because they feel that if the society can treat me with that level of disregard, then I don't have to have regard for you. And so if I only got a primary education and you get in my way in my hustle, I will treat you equally as the way the police treat me. And it's the citizens that face the brunt of that, not the police, because they know they can't go and jump for the police. And so we continue to degrade the society. We continue to express our inability to cope with some basic interactions. But I thank you.
And I thank you, Brother Nigel, for coming on and for going beyond the call of duty. We went over by more than half an hour, but it was worth it. The audience has stayed with us, and they're all expressing their gratitude for, and they are saying it, the level of civility in the discussion. I think sometimes we underrate our people's ability to imagine another world, as Andaye would put it. Imagine that another world is possible. And they know it when they see it, when they smell it. Nigel, thank you so much for coming on. And I shall hear from you tomorrow as you go to court in defense of a brother. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, and good night to your listeners.
And I want to say thank you all, and the WP, on behalf of the WP, I want to thank all of you who have contributed to the defense fund. You know, our brother was put on $100,000 bail. We were able to bail him from that fund. We don't know if other charges are coming. We don't know what other fees. So we welcome those of you who've contributed to the fund. We are going to formally say thanks to all of you. In an individual capacity, but for now I want to say on behalf of the WPA, thanks to those of you who've contributed to the fund. We would like to ask those of you who have not gotten around yet to contribute to the fund to please do so. The Cash App handle is on there. The PayPal handle, which is the same as the Zelle handle. Thank you all so much. We know 11 Dotty Bildam, and times are rough. Times are rough. But I always remember in the old days when I came out in politics, we used to pass the hat around at public meetings. And, you know, those old ladies and old men would put their 25 cents, which was a lot of money in those days, their 10 cents. When you see $1, you highlight up. But that was the tradition at public meetings. All the parties did it. And so those people come to public meetings with their little donation to give to the political parties. As we've moved further away, we have lost that tradition, you know, but what is lost can be regained. Circumstances can push us back there. Thank you all tonight. And tomorrow night, we're going to have our last program for the week, because, you know, this is Holy Week. After tomorrow, it will be Good Friday, Easter Saturday, or Holy Saturday, I think they call it, Easter Sunday, and I think Easter Monday. But certainly the next Good Friday, Easter Saturday, Easter Sunday will be off. And so tomorrow night will be our last show before we do what we got to do. And you all know, some of us, the crucifixion is important, but a lot of us, it's about the resurrection, the resurrection. So Easter has great significance to our people. Good night. Good night. On behalf of Brother Nigel, I want to say thanks and that we love you all, and we are trying to build a society of reason, a community of reason. Dr. King talked about the beloved community. We are talking here about a community of reason. Reason that is grounded in resistance. We got to do something. That's what Brother Nigel said. We have to be doers. Doesn't mean that you go and behave crazy on the road and you go picketing, and that's not the only thing that we can do. C.L.R. James says, there is always something to be done. Always. And we've got to become doers. And some of you, like I said, have done something by contributing to the Defense Fund. Others of you can follow. But there are other things that we can do righteously, righteously, righteously. Good night until tomorrow night.